The envelope that shattered illusions. Victoria Steele stood at the edge of her marble-floored living room, gazing through the towering windows of her penthouse. Below, the city pulsed with life, its skyscrapers glinting under the morning sun. The warmth of the light seemed to mock her. On the sleek coffee table behind her lay the envelope that had upended her entire world. It had arrived that morning, addressed to her with no return address. The contents were devastating. Photographs of her husband, Jonathan Steele, cozied up with another woman, a woman far too familiar. Amelia Grant, a junior associate at Steele Enterprises, looked radiant in the pictures, her arm brushing Jonathan's in every frame. The setting was damning. A luxurious private suite in one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Victoria's chest tightened as she remembered the promise she'd made to herself when she married Jonathan a decade ago. Loyalty above all. She had poured herself into supporting him, investing her wealth, earned from years of hard work and smart decisions, into his ventures. Yet here she was, betrayed and blindsided. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Julian Carter, her personal assistant, and the one person she could trust implicitly. Julian, Victoria, there's more. We need to talk immediately. Victoria grabbed her coat and rushed out. The elevator ride down from her penthouse felt agonizingly slow, each floor mocking her sense of control. When she reached her private driver waiting below, her voice was steely. To the office. Now. The discovery. Julian met her at the private entrance of Steele Enterprises, his usual composed demeanor cracked with urgency. He ushered her into a secure conference room, locking the door behind them. Victoria, he began, sliding a USB drive across the table. What I found goes far beyond an affair. Victoria inserted the drive into her laptop, her heart pounding as files opened on the screen. The first was a series of financial transactions. Her husband had been siphoning company funds into an offshore account for months. Her stomach churned as she saw the amounts. Millions stolen from the company she had helped build. I cross-referenced these transactions with other data, Julian said. He's been leaking proprietary information to Conrad Industries, one of our biggest competitors. And Amelia isn't just involved with him. She's working with him on this. Victoria's mind reeled. It wasn't just betrayal. It was treason against the empire her father had entrusted to her care. Steele Enterprises was her father's legacy, a pillar of integrity in an industry rife with greed. And Jonathan, the man she had loved and trusted, had not only jeopardized her marriage, but also the company's future. Does anyone else know about this? Victoria asked, her voice sharp. Not yet, Julian replied. But I found something else. He hesitated, then handed her a manila folder. Inside were more photos, this time of Jonathan meeting Conrad Ford, the ruthless CEO of Conrad Industries. The last photo made Victoria's blood run cold. It showed Jonathan signing what appeared to be a document under Conrad's smug gaze. That's their plan, Julian explained. They're staging a hostile takeover. Jonathan's betrayal is just the beginning. A call for allies. Victoria leaned back, her mind racing. She couldn't confront Jonathan yet. He was cunning and would deny everything without concrete proof. She needed allies. Her first call was to Miranda Bishop, her father's trusted lawyer, and the family's longtime confidant. Miranda's sharp mind and unwavering integrity made her an invaluable asset in this crisis. When Miranda arrived at the office, her piercing blue eyes scanned the evidence quickly. "This is damning," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "But if you want to stop this, you need to move fast. Jonathan and Conrad won't hesitate to destroy everything." Victoria nodded. "I need more evidence. Julian, can you dig deeper?" Julian nodded. "I'll need to tap into private communications, emails, encrypted chats. It won't be easy, but I can do it." "Do it," Victoria said firmly. And Miranda, prepare whatever legal measures we'll need to block Conrad's moves. Miranda smiled faintly. I'll do more than block them. I'll cripple them. The secret weapon. As the day wore on, Victoria found herself alone in her office, staring at her father's portrait on the wall. Richard Steele had been a man of unshakable principles, a visionary who had built Steele Enterprises from the ground up. His belief in loyalty and justice echoed in Victoria's heart now, guiding her resolve. Her thoughts were interrupted by Julian, who entered with a look of triumph. I got something, he said, setting his laptop on her desk. He played an audio recording, a conversation between Jonathan and Conrad. They're preparing to announce the takeover at the next board meeting, Julian explained. But they're also planning to frame you for mismanagement, claiming you funneled company money for personal use. Victoria's fists clenched. They think they can paint me as the villain. Exactly, Julian said. But there's more. They've already secured backing from 2 board members, Howard Fields and Samantha Lynn. Victoria's heart sank. Howard and Samantha were influential figures in the company, and their support could swing any decision in Jonathan's favor. I won't let them win, she said, her voice steady. We'll expose them before they have a chance. Julian nodded. What's the plan? Victoria's eyes glinted with determination. We fight fire with fire. And we start with Howard and Samantha. Setting the trap. Victoria spent the night strategizing with Julian and Miranda. They would set a trap to expose Jonathan and Conrad's treachery in front of the entire board. It would require precision, risk, and impeccable timing. The first step was turning Howard and Samantha back to her side. Julian uncovered evidence of Howard's financial struggles and Samantha's secret dealings with Conrad Industries. Armed with this leverage, Victoria arranged private meetings with both of them. You can side with Jonathan and Conrad, Victoria told Howard, her voice icy. But when their scheme collapses, and it will, you'll go down with them. Or you can help me ensure this company survives, and I'll make sure your debts are taken care of. Howard hesitated but eventually agreed, his desperation outweighing his loyalty to Jonathan. Samantha was more resistant, but Miranda's legal threats proved persuasive. The calm before the storm. By the next morning, Victoria's trap was set. The evidence was ready, her allies were in place, and the stage was prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. But as she stood before the mirror, adjusting her tailored suit, she felt a flicker of doubt. What if this wasn't enough? What if Jonathan and Conrad had an ace up their sleeve? She shook off the thought, her father's voice echoing in her mind. Adversity reveals who we truly are. Victoria wasn't just fighting for her company or her marriage. She was fighting for her father's legacy, for her employees' futures, and for her own dignity. The board meeting would begin in an hour, and when it did, Jonathan Steele would realize that his carefully constructed betrayal was about to crumble. Setting the stage for the confrontation, the boardroom of Steele Enterprises exuded an air of polished power, its mahogany table gleaming under the soft glow of pendant lights. As Victoria Steele stood in the corridor outside the imposing double doors, her heartbeat was steady, yet her mind raced. Everything depended on the next few hours. Julian's voice crackled in her earpiece. We're all set, Victoria. The team has secured the technical setup, and the files are ready to display. We'll monitor everything from the control room. Good, Victoria replied, her tone sharp with determination. Let's ensure there are no mistakes. This needs to be flawless. She adjusted her navy suit, smoothing invisible wrinkles as if preparing armor for battle. Taking a deep breath, she entered the boardroom with an air of calm confidence. Around the table, board members shifted in their chairs, their conversations hushed as her presence commanded attention. Jonathan Steele sat at the head of the table, his charm carefully curated. His dark hair was slicked back, his tailored suit a little too perfect. The sight of him sent a pang of anger through Victoria, but she masked it expertly. Beside him, Amelia Grant, poised and composed, exuded the smug arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable. Jonathan's eyes met Victoria's briefly, a flicker of unease in his gaze. He didn't know what she had planned, and that was her greatest weapon. A tense beginning. The meeting began with the usual agenda items: financial reports, quarterly projections, and updates on various departments. Victoria allowed the routine discussions to play out, her expression impassive. She was acutely aware of Jonathan's attempts to steer the conversation toward his impending announcement, his tone laced with a false sense of urgency. "Before we continue," Jonathan interjected smoothly, "I have a significant proposal to bring to the table." Victoria raised a hand, cutting him off with a polite yet firm smile. "Actually, I'd like to address an issue of critical importance first." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to proceed. "Of course, Victoria. The floor is yours." Victoria nodded to Julian, who was monitoring the meeting from a secure location. Within seconds, the large screen at the end of the room came to life, displaying a series of documents. The board members leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. "What you're about to see," Victoria began, her voice measured and authoritative, "is evidence of a betrayal that strikes at the heart of this company." The screen shifted to show financial records, highlighting unauthorized transfers linked to Jonathan's offshore accounts. Gasps rippled through the room as Victoria continued, her gaze unwavering. "These transactions, orchestrated by Jonathan Steele, represent a deliberate effort to embezzle company funds for personal gain. But that's not all." The screen transitioned to emails and recorded conversations, revealing Jonathan's collusion with Conrad Ford. The boardroom descended into stunned silence as the depth of the scheme unfolded. Jonathan's defense. Jonathan's composure faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his voice smooth as silk. "This is absurd, Victoria. These so-called evidence files could have been fabricated by anyone with an agenda. Are you really going to tarnish this company's reputation with baseless accusations?" Victoria met his gaze, her voice cold. "You've underestimated me, Jonathan. This isn't just about my word against yours. It's about the truth." She gestured to Julian, who played the final recording, a conversation between Jonathan and Conrad discussing their plan to stage a hostile takeover of Steele Enterprises. The recording ended with Jonathan's chilling words: "By the time Victoria realizes what's happening, it'll be too late." The room erupted into chaos. Board members whispered furiously, their loyalty to Jonathan now fractured. Amelia, seated beside Jonathan, shifted uncomfortably, her confident facade cracking under the weight of the evidence. Amelia's collapse. As the accusations mounted, Victoria shifted her attention to Amelia. "Miss Grant," she said, her tone sharp, "would you care to explain your role in this?" Amelia's face turned pale, her confidence replaced by fear. I was only following orders," she stammered. "Jonathan, he said it was just a business strategy. I didn't know." "Save your excuses," Victoria interrupted, her voice slicing through the air. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Your actions have jeopardized the livelihoods of countless employees and the legacy this company represents." Amelia's shoulders sagged, her defiance extinguished. It was clear that she was no match for Victoria's unwavering resolve. The allies strike back. Before Jonathan could regain control of the narrative, Howard Fields and Samantha Lynn, the board members Victoria had secured as allies, spoke up. "Victoria's evidence is damning," Howard said, his voice firm. "It's clear that Jonathan has acted against the best interests of this company. We cannot allow this to continue." Samantha nodded in agreement. "I've worked with Victoria long enough to know she's committed to this company's success. Jonathan, on the other hand, has betrayed us all." Their statements solidified the board's shift in loyalty. Jonathan's allies were now outnumbered, and the tide of power was turning against him. The turning point. As the meeting reached its climax, Victoria delivered her final blow. She revealed a motion, signed by a majority of the board members, to suspend Jonathan Steele from his position, effective immediately. The motion also called for a full investigation into his actions and a legal injunction to block Conrad Ford's influence over Steele Enterprises. Jonathan stood, his face red with anger. "You think you've won, Victoria. This isn't over. You'll regret this." Victoria rose from her seat, her gaze piercing. "The only thing I regret is trusting you. Your actions have consequences, Jonathan, and it's time you faced them." A Pyrrhic victory. As the boardroom doors closed behind a defeated Jonathan, Victoria felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Conrad Ford was still a threat, and Steele Enterprises would need to rebuild its reputation in the wake of the scandal. Julian met her in the corridor, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," he said. "You exposed him." Victoria nodded, her resolve firm. This was just the first step. Now we focus on securing the company's future. As she walked back to her office, the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a spark of hope. Victoria Steele was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the strength of her allies and the unshakable belief in her own resilience. Shadows in the boardroom. Victoria Steele sat alone in her office, the muted hum of the city below her barely registering. The confrontation with Jonathan had been a victory, but the cost was beginning to weigh on her. The betrayal was deeper than she had anticipated, and the shadows of doubt still lingered. Conrad Ford wasn't the kind of man who would retreat quietly into the night, and Jonathan's parting words, "This isn't over," replayed in her mind like a broken record. Her father's portrait stared down at her, his steady gaze a silent reminder of the legacy she was fighting to protect. Richard Steele had built Steele Enterprises on principles of integrity and loyalty, but those ideals had been eroded from within. Now, Victoria was left to rebuild not only the company's reputation, but also her own trust in the people around her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Julian, carrying a laptop and a stack of documents. "We have a problem," he said, his tone grave as he set the items on her desk. Victoria gestured for him to continue, bracing herself. "Conrad isn't backing down," Julian said. "He's launched a public smear campaign against you. Articles are popping up across news outlets accusing you of mismanagement, nepotism, and using the company as your personal bank account. Investors are starting to get skittish." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. He's using anonymous sources to spread this nonsense." Julian nodded. "Exactly. And he's already targeting a few of our key clients, trying to lure them away with promises of better deals." Victoria exhaled sharply. "What about the board? Are they standing firm?" "For now," Julian said. "But Conrad's influence is strong. He's leveraging every connection. He has to sway them." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The battle wasn't just about evidence or loyalty anymore. It was about perception. Conrad was playing dirty, and she had no choice but to meet him on his own battlefield. A meeting of minds. Determined to regain control of the narrative, Victoria called an emergency meeting with her inner circle: Julian, Miranda Bishop, and Elijah Clark. The three of them arrived at her penthouse late that evening, the weight of the situation evident in their expressions. Miranda was the first to speak. "We need to counter Conrad's campaign immediately. If we let these accusations fester, they'll become the truth in the eyes of the public." Victoria nodded. "I agree, but we need to do more than just respond. We need to shift the focus entirely to him." Elijah, who had been poring over documents, looked up. "We have leverage. Conrad's network is riddled with shady dealings, and the FBI's investigation is still ongoing. If we can expose his corruption before he solidifies his position, we can dismantle his operation." Miranda frowned. "That's easier said than done. Conrad has layers of protection. He doesn't leave a paper trail." "That's where I come in," Julian interjected. "I've been working with the FBI to track his financial movements. He's been funneling money through a series of shell companies, and we're close to identifying a major weak point." Victoria's eyes narrowed. What's the weak point? Julian hesitated. A high-profile investor, Margaret Calloway. She's been quietly backing Conrad's ventures for years, but her name doesn't appear in any official records. If we can link her to his illegal activities, it'll be a blow he can't recover from. Victoria tapped her fingers on the table, considering the implications. Margaret Calloway was a powerful figure, known for her philanthropy and business acumen. Exposing her involvement would be risky, but it could also be the key to turning the tide. Then that's our next move, she said decisively. We bring Margaret into the light. A dangerous game. The next day, Victoria met with Elijah and Julian to devise a plan. Elijah would dig deeper into Margaret's financial connections, while Julian worked with the FBI to gather solid evidence. Miranda would prepare the legal framework to ensure the information was airtight. As they worked, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Conrad was a master manipulator, and every moment they delayed gave him more opportunities to tighten his grip. Elijah's investigation uncovered a critical lead. A series of transactions linking Margaret's charitable foundation to Conrad's shell companies. On the surface, the transactions appeared legitimate, but closer scrutiny revealed discrepancies that suggested money laundering. This is it, Elijah said, showing Victoria the documents. If we can tie this to Conrad's larger operation, it's game over. Victoria nodded, her determination hardening. Then we go public, but we need to do it strategically. They decided to hold a press conference, framing the revelations as part of Victoria's commitment to transparency and integrity. It was a risky move, but Victoria knew she had no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter the consequences. The press conference. The day of the press conference arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Journalists, investors, and employees packed the atrium of Steele Enterprises, their curiosity mingled with tension. Victoria stood at the podium, her navy suit impeccable, her expression calm but resolute. She began by addressing the allegations against her. In recent weeks, Steele Enterprises has faced a barrage of accusations, many of them baseless and designed to undermine our integrity. Today, I want to set the record straight. Victoria presented the evidence of Conrad's corruption, her voice steady as she walked the audience through the details. She spoke of Margaret Calloway's involvement, the shell companies, and the illegal transactions. As she spoke, images and documents appeared on the large screen behind her, painting a damning picture of Conrad's operation. The room was silent, the weight of the revelations sinking in. Victoria concluded with a message of resilience. Steele Enterprises was built on principles of trust and innovation. We will not be brought down by those who seek to exploit us. We will rise above this stronger than ever. The audience erupted into applause, but Victoria knew the battle wasn't over. Conrad would retaliate, and she had to be ready. The aftermath. That evening, Victoria received a call from Julian. "We've got him," he said, his voice tinged with triumph. The FBI raided one of Conrad's facilities. They found evidence that ties him directly to the laundering scheme. Relief washed over Victoria, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight had taken a toll on everyone involved. Steele Enterprises was safe for now, but the scars of the battle would linger. As she sat in her father's old chair, staring out at the city, Victoria allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had faced betrayal, doubt, and overwhelming odds, but she had emerged stronger. Her father's legacy was intact, and her own was just beginning. The war wasn't over, but Victoria Steele was ready for whatever came next. The enemy's counterstrike. The relief following the FBI's raid was short-lived. Barely 2 days after the press conference, Steele Enterprises found itself under siege once again, not from Conrad directly, but from a wave of strategic attacks that seemed designed to destabilize the company from within. Anonymous whistleblower reports flooded regulatory agencies, claiming Steele Enterprises had engaged in unethical practices. Several key clients began reconsidering their contracts, citing concerns about the company's stability. Victoria Steele sat at the head of the war room table, surrounded by her core team. The air was thick with tension. Julian, Miranda, and Elijah were there, along with the heads of Steele Enterprises' key departments. On the walls, monitors displayed real-time data, plummeting stock prices, social media backlash, and endless streams of headlines questioning the company's future. "Conrad is trying to smother us before we recover," Julian said, his tone grim. "These whistleblower reports are too coordinated to be a coincidence. He's behind this." Victoria leaned forward, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. "Then we need to hit back harder. What's our next move?" Miranda adjusted her glasses. "We've already refuted the allegations publicly, but it's not enough. These reports are sowing doubt among regulators and investors. We need to turn the focus back to Conrad's corruption." Elijah nodded. "We also need to shore up our defenses internally. He's exploiting weak points within the company. Employees who are disillusioned or easily manipulated. We need to rebuild trust from the ground up." Victoria exhaled, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Then let's divide and conquer. Miranda, I need you to handle the legal front. File counterclaims against these whistleblowers and expose their connections to Conrad. Elijah, work with it to secure our systems and identify any internal vulnerabilities. Julian, I want you to double down on our PR efforts. Make it clear that Steele Enterprises won't back down." She paused, her voice hardening. "We didn't come this far to lose now." A widening rift. Despite their efforts, the attacks continued. Victoria's nights were sleepless, her mind racing with strategies and counter-strategies. She spent long hours in her office, poring over financial reports and crisis plans. Her once dominant presence at Steele Enterprises now carried a shadow of vulnerability, something her employees noticed. The tension began to affect her relationships within the company. Department heads, already stressed by the chaos, started questioning her decisions. Whispers of doubt circulated in the hallways. Some employees blamed her for the turmoil, believing her public battle with Conrad was drawing unnecessary attention to the company. One evening, Victoria confronted one of these skeptics, Michael Trent, the head of the manufacturing division. She had overheard him voicing concerns to a group of senior managers about her leadership. "You don't think I'm fit to lead, Michael?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that, Victoria. It's just this fight with Conrad. It's costing us. Maybe it's time to reconsider our approach." Victoria stepped closer, her tone icy. "Reconsider? Conrad is trying to destroy everything my father built. This isn't just a battle for Steele Enterprises. It's a battle for integrity in our industry. If you can't see that, perhaps you're in the wrong place." Michael hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll support you, but I hope you know what you're doing." An unexpected ally. As tensions within the company mounted, Victoria received a surprising phone call from Margaret Calloway. The disgraced investor, whose ties to Conrad had been exposed during the press conference, wanted to meet. Against Miranda's advice, Victoria agreed, sensing an opportunity. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Margaret arrived in a simple black coat, her usual polished demeanor replaced by a weariness that Victoria hadn't expected. "Victoria," Margaret began, her voice subdued, "I owe you an explanation." Victoria's expression was unreadable. "Go on." Margaret sighed. "I made a mistake aligning myself with Conrad. He promised returns that were too good to resist, but I didn't know the extent of his operations. When I realized what he was doing, how far he was willing to go, I tried to back out, but it was too late." "Why are you telling me this now?" Victoria asked, her tone skeptical. "Because Conrad is more dangerous than you realize," Margaret replied. "He doesn't just ruin businesses, he destroys lives. If you want to stop him, you'll need more than just evidence. You'll need leverage." Victoria leaned forward. "And what kind of leverage do you have?" Margaret hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents linking Conrad to an offshore trust fund used to bribe high-ranking officials. The evidence was damning, but it came with a price. "I'll give you everything," Margaret said, "but in return, I want immunity. I can't afford to be dragged down with him." Victoria studied Margaret carefully. The woman's desperation was palpable, but so was her sincerity. After a long pause, Victoria nodded. "You'll have your immunity, but if I find out you're hiding anything, this deal is off." The plan takes shape. Armed with Margaret's evidence, Victoria reconvened her inner circle. They devised a multi-pronged strategy to use the documents against Conrad. Miranda would work with federal prosecutors to build a case, while Elijah and Julian would craft a media campaign to turn the public narrative in Steele Enterprises' favor. "Conrad's bribes are the key," Miranda said. "If we can expose the officials he's been paying off, it'll dismantle his network from the top down." Julian grinned. "And once the media gets wind of this, Conrad's reputation will be in shreds. He won't be able to recover." Victoria's confidence grew as the plan took shape. For the first time in weeks, she felt like they were gaining the upper hand. But she knew better than to underestimate Conrad. The man was a master at turning the tables. The final blow. The plan was set into motion the following week. Miranda delivered the evidence to federal prosecutors, who launched a formal investigation into Conrad's activities. At the same time, Elijah and Julian released a series of exposes detailing the extent of Conrad's corruption and the officials he had bribed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story, investors distanced themselves from Conrad, and regulatory agencies began freezing his assets. Within days, Conrad's empire began to crumble. But Conrad wasn't going down without a fight. He issued a public statement, denying the allegations and accusing Steele Enterprises of orchestrating a smear campaign. His words carried little weight, though, as the evidence against him continued to pile up. For Victoria, the victory was bittersweet. She had won the battle, but the scars it left on her company and her personal life were undeniable. Steele Enterprises would need years to rebuild, and the trust she had once taken for granted would take even longer to restore. A new beginning. As the dust began to settle, Victoria stood in the boardroom, addressing her team. "This has been the hardest battle of my life," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But it's also been the most important. We've proven that integrity matters, that no matter how powerful our enemies are, we can stand against them." The room erupted into applause, a sign that despite everything, her employees still believed in her. As she left the boardroom, Julian caught up with her. "You did it, Victoria," he said. "You saved the company." Victoria smiled faintly. "No, Julian. We saved the company. I couldn't have done this without all of you." She walked out of the building and into the crisp evening air, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. The cost of victory. Victoria Steele sat in the silence of her penthouse, the city's lights sprawling below her like a sea of flickering stars. It had been 3 weeks since Steele Enterprises dealt the final blow to Conrad Ford's empire. The media buzz was finally dying down, the investigations into Conrad's bribery scandal expanding beyond anything Victoria had anticipated. Federal agencies were taking over the prosecution, and every day brought news of more high-profile arrests. Yet victory had come at a cost. The company's stock had stabilized, but not before it dipped sharply, rattling investors and shaking the confidence of even her staunchest allies. Several board members had resigned in the fallout, citing stress and an unwillingness to remain embroiled in the chaos. Clients, though returning, were cautious. Even within the company, the atmosphere was strained. Trust didn't rebuild overnight. Victoria sighed as she turned her attention to the folder on her desk. It contained the latest internal audit reports, a grim reminder of the fractures left by Jonathan and Conrad's betrayal. While she had survived the storm, the cracks in Steele Enterprises' foundation were glaringly obvious. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Julian. "Victoria, you need to see this," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "Check the news." Victoria grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. On the screen, a familiar face appeared, Jonathan Steele. He was seated across from a polished reporter, his expression carefully composed. Jonathan's return. The interview was being broadcast live, and Jonathan, true to form, was spinning a narrative that bordered on fantasy. "I was coerced," he said, his voice measured and solemn. "Conrad Ford manipulated me. He threatened my family, my career. I regret the choices I made, but I want to set the record straight. I never intended to harm Steele Enterprises or Victoria." Victoria's jaw tightened as she watched him weave his web of lies. The reporter leaned in, feigning sympathy. "So, you're saying you were a victim in all of this?" Jonathan nodded, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "Absolutely. I made mistakes, but they were mistakes born of fear, not malice. I still cared deeply for the company and for Victoria. I hope, in time, she can forgive me." Julian's voice crackled through the phone. "He's trying to salvage his reputation. If he succeeds, it could undermine everything we've accomplished." Victoria turned off the TV, her mind already racing. Jonathan's sudden reappearance wasn't just a coincidence. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger. The hidden threat. The next day, Victoria met with her inner circle, Julian, Miranda, and Elijah, to discuss the implications of Jonathan's interview. "He's trying to rewrite the narrative," Miranda said, her tone icy. "If people start believing his version of events, it could cast doubt on your leadership and the legitimacy of the evidence we've presented." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about his reputation. Jonathan's playing a longer game. If he can regain public sympathy, he might be positioning himself for a legal challenge, or worse, a return to Steele Enterprises." Victoria's heart sank at the thought. The idea of Jonathan regaining any power within the company was unthinkable, but she knew Elijah was right. Jonathan was nothing if not calculating. "Then we need to get ahead of him," Victoria said, her voice firm. "We expose the full extent of his betrayal. No more holding back." A dangerous proposition. Later that evening, as Victoria was reviewing documents in her office, Julian approached her with an uncharacteristically hesitant expression. "There's something we haven't discussed," he began. "Jonathan's offshore accounts. They were frozen after the FBI raid, but there's a trail we didn't fully investigate." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trail?" Julian hesitated. "It's not just money. There are communications, encrypted messages between Jonathan and someone using the alias Warden. Whoever this is, they were working with him and Conrad. They might still be active." Victoria leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Do we know who they are?" "Not yet," Julian admitted. "But if we can crack the encryption, we might uncover something that could end Jonathan's game for good." Victoria's mind raced. The prospect of unearthing another player in Jonathan's schemes was both thrilling and daunting. "How risky is it?" "Very," Julian said. "We'd need to use some unconventional methods that might not be entirely legal." Victoria exhaled slowly. The stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't afford to let Jonathan regain the upper hand. "Do it," she said finally, "but be careful. We can't afford any mistakes." The encryption cracked. Over the next week, Julian worked tirelessly with a team of cybersecurity experts to crack the encrypted messages. When they finally succeeded, the contents were explosive. The messages revealed a coordinated effort between Jonathan, Conrad, and Warden to dismantle Steele Enterprises piece by piece. But what struck Victoria most was the timing. Some of the messages predated Jonathan's marriage to her. "This wasn't just betrayal," Victoria said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This was premeditated. He married me as part of a scheme." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. Julian broke the silence. "Victoria, this changes everything. If we release this, Jonathan's entire narrative crumbles." Victoria nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure the world sees the truth." The final exposure. Victoria decided to release the messages through a carefully planned press conference. She worked with Miranda and Julian to craft a statement that left no room for doubt. The press conference was held at Steele Enterprises headquarters, the atrium packed with journalists. Victoria stood at the podium, her expression calm but fierce. "Today, I'm sharing the truth about the betrayal Steele Enterprises has endured. This is not just about me or my family. It's about integrity and the lengths some will go to destroy it." As she unveiled the messages, the room buzzed with shock and outrage. The evidence was undeniable, painting Jonathan as a manipulative conspirator who had sought to exploit the company from the very beginning. When the conference ended, the media frenzy was immediate. Headlines declared Jonathan Steele as a traitor, and public opinion turned sharply against him. Even his few remaining allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his name. A hollow victory. That night, Victoria sat alone in her office, staring out at the city. She had won. Jonathan's reputation was irreparably damaged, and Steele Enterprises was finally free from his shadow. Yet the victory felt hollow. The fight had taken everything from her. Her marriage, her trust in others, and even pieces of herself. Julian entered the room, breaking her reverie. "You did it, Victoria," he said softly. "Jonathan won't recover from this." Victoria nodded, but her smile was faint. "We saved the company, Julian. But what about the cost?" Julian didn't answer, and for a moment, the silence between them spoke volumes. The battle was over, but the scars would remain. As Victoria left the office that night, she carried a renewed sense of purpose. She had endured betrayal, fought against impossible odds, and emerged stronger. Steele Enterprises was her legacy now, and she would rebuild it brick by brick. The rise of Steele Enterprises. The weeks following the public exposure of Jonathan Steele's betrayal were marked by a whirlwind of media attention, legal maneuvers, and corporate soul-searching. Steele Enterprises, once shaken to its core, was beginning to stabilize. But Victoria Steele knew the battle wasn't over. If anything, it had entered a new phase. The fight to rebuild trust and ensure the company's survival in an industry that thrived on ruthlessness. Victoria stood on the balcony of her penthouse, watching the sun rise over the city. It was a rare moment of peace, but her mind was far from still. The question that haunted her now wasn't whether Steele Enterprises could survive. It was whether she could lead it to thrive. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her. It was Julian. "Victoria, I just got off the phone with Elijah," he said. "He's made progress on the restructuring plan. We need you in the office ASAP." "I'm on my way," Victoria replied, her tone resolute. The plan to rebuild. The boardroom was quieter than usual, with fewer members seated around the table. The resignations that followed Jonathan's exposure had left gaps in leadership, but Victoria saw this as an opportunity to rebuild the team with people she could trust. Elijah stood at the head of the room, a large presentation displayed on the screen behind him. "This restructuring plan is bold," he began, "but it's what we need to not only recover, but also redefine ourselves in the market." The plan focused on three key areas: innovation, transparency, and sustainability. Steele Enterprises would pivot away from its reliance on traditional markets and invest heavily in emerging technologies. It would also implement new governance measures to prevent future betrayals, including stricter oversight and enhanced cybersecurity protocols. Miranda chimed in. "We'll need to be aggressive about communicating these changes to our stakeholders. This isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about showing the world that we've learned from our mistakes." Victoria nodded. "We'll launch a campaign to highlight our new direction. This isn't just a pivot. It's a rebirth." Facing internal resistance. Not everyone was on board with the changes. Some senior executives, loyal to the old ways, pushed back against the proposed reforms. Victoria faced them head-on during a heated meeting. "This company was built on tradition," argued Michael Trent, the manufacturing head who had clashed with Victoria before. "These changes could alienate our longtime clients and disrupt our operations." Victoria's voice was calm but firm. "Tradition didn't protect us from betrayal, Michael. Tradition didn't save us from Conrad Ford or Jonathan. Innovation and integrity will. If you can't align yourself with this vision, you're welcome to step aside." The room fell silent. Michael's face was a mix of frustration and defeat, but he didn't argue further. Later that evening, Miranda approached Victoria privately. "You handled that well," she said, "but don't underestimate how deeply some of these people are rooted in the old ways." "I won't," Victoria replied. "But I'm done letting fear dictate our future." A new ally emerges. Amid the turmoil, an unexpected figure reached out to Victoria. Grace Ford, Conrad Ford's estranged daughter. Grace had distanced herself from her father years ago, building her own reputation as a forward-thinking entrepreneur. Now she wanted to meet. They arranged to meet at a discreet location, a quiet cafe far from the city center. Grace was striking, with a sharp intellect that reminded Victoria of herself. "I'll be honest," Grace began. "I've never had much faith in my father. His methods have always been predatory. But I respect what you've done, Victoria. You stood up to him in a way few people have." Victoria studied her carefully. "Why are you here, Grace? What do you want?" Grace leaned in, her tone serious. "I want to help you. My father's empire is crumbling, but some of his assets are still intact. Assets that could benefit Steel Enterprises. If you're willing to take them." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Why would you offer me this?" Grace smiled faintly. "Because I want to see his legacy erased, and because I think Steel Enterprises could do something meaningful with what he's left behind." The turning point. With Grace's cooperation, Victoria and her team secured key assets from Conrad's dissolving empire, including advanced technologies and intellectual property. These acquisitions not only bolstered Steel Enterprises' innovation efforts, but also sent a clear message to the industry. Steel Enterprises was rising stronger than ever. Julian and Elijah worked tirelessly to integrate the new assets into the company's operations, while Miranda ensured that every deal was legally airtight. The media, initially skeptical of the acquisitions, began to shift their narrative, praising Victoria's strategic vision. The culmination of these efforts was a highly anticipated product launch, a cutting-edge AI-driven logistics platform that promised to revolutionize supply chain management. The launch event, held at Steel Enterprises headquarters, was attended by industry leaders, journalists, and investors. Victoria stood on the stage, her voice confident as she addressed the audience. "This isn't just a product. It's a symbol of who we are. Steel Enterprises has faced challenges that would have broken lesser companies, but we're still here, stronger and more determined than ever." The applause was thunderous, and Victoria felt a swell of pride. For the first time in months, she saw a clear path forward, healing the past. While Steel Enterprises was rebuilding, Victoria also worked to repair her personal life. Her relationship with her younger brother, Daniel, had been strained during the turmoil. Daniel, who had always stayed out of the corporate spotlight, had felt betrayed by Jonathan and uncertain about Victoria's ability to lead. One evening, she invited him to her penthouse for dinner. Over glasses of wine, they finally talked openly. "I never doubted your strength, Victoria," Daniel admitted. "I just didn't know if you could handle everything alone." "I didn't handle it alone," Victoria replied, her voice soft. "I had people I could trust, and I'd like to count you among them again." Daniel smiled. "You always could. I just needed to see that you didn't lose yourself in the fight." The legacy continues. Months later, Steel Enterprises had not only recovered but also exceeded expectations. The company's stock reached an all-time high, clients returned in droves, and new partnerships flourished. Victoria's leadership had transformed the company into a model of resilience and innovation. As she walked through the bustling headquarters one afternoon, employees stopped to greet her, their respect and admiration clear. Victoria paused in front of her father's portrait in the lobby, her reflection merging with his image. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for everything." Victoria Steele had faced betrayal, adversity, and the weight of her father's legacy. But she had emerged not just as a survivor, but as a leader who had carved her own path. Steele Enterprises was hers now, a symbol of resilience, integrity, and the power of unwavering determination.